Hello, good afternoon. We find ourselves toward the end here, and we're getting into the alleged causes of the Civil War. What I do on this assignment is there are so many different nuances and different specific theses that I just went to the two broad ones, all right, and kept it within that simple bifurcation between court history and revisionist history, kind of a generic revisionist historical interpretation to the War for Independence. With that, it's important to remember that court historians find themselves in quite a predicament in trying to advocate American exceptionalism in covering slavery. They have to blush. They have to kind of say, oops, on behalf of the founding fathers and the leaders of the country for quite some time, and saying, well, that was our great, hypocritical anomaly. That was the one that stands out of the ordinary in such a normally exceptional country, right? So what they do then is they say, finally, we experienced a generation that rectified it, that made things right, and that intended to do such with all the best of intentions in taking this stain out of our republic, right? And so from that, African American historians and others, are a little bit reticent with court history as far as its prevalence now. For one, it doesn't give due credit to African American agency, what they did amongst themselves, and also they don't want credit given where it's not necessarily warranted. Now, of course, they know that we're going to establish by the end of the Civil War the 13th Amendment, ending slavery, the 14th Amendment, which enfranchised anyone born or naturalized in any of the states, and granting all the rights, protections, and privileges of citizenship to anyone under that broad category. And so the Bill of Rights was nationalized to all the states after the Civil War. And then they stated in the 15th Amendment that just in case it's not obvious that the rights, protections, and privileges of citizenship include suffrage, the right to participate politically, run for office, vote, etc., that is the case, and that it shall not be deprived of anyone on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So no doubt, legally, much is finally rectified by the end of the Civil War. The 19 states in the North prevailed in the Civil War. The Republican Party, was predominantly a Northern party, and it was the party that initiated this legislation. These amendments, etc., was at the forefront of it. And also they're going to try to reconstruct the South, bring it up to date, and with literally troops staying down in the South at the end of the Civil War. So it's kind of easy when you're a child to make this simple, again, kind of bifurcation between the heroic North and Republican Party and the defiant, unjust South and Democratic Party that wanted to keep slavery alive. And of course, after all the interpretations that have received a lot of academic attention, etc., that simplistic narrative has not survived unscathed, right? So we're going to look at this here, okay? So with number one, I take the kind of court history route in somewhat vilifying the Democrats of the South. All right. I try to act like I'm being objective in addressing this question, but I'm really not. With the facts that I choose to select, with the depiction of the Southern Democrats that I choose to convey, I'm not being objective. All right. And so I asked the question, could the American Civil War have been averted? Could we have come to terms diplomatically without having to fight this bloody civil war that ended the lives of over 600,000 Americans from 1861 to 1865. So in it, I try to give the main points that historians usually use as context for what, should have been known by the political leaders in Congress in the early to mid 1800s. All right. So firstly, right, we have a national, a national, almost explicit, it's somewhere between implicit and explicit, condoning of slavery by the federal government. We have the 20-year, first of all, when they decide on the number of House reps, they say that you only count the free persons who are counted as civilians, and every state got to decide who was a civilian, right? And it was always white property mill owners in virtually every state initially. And so you only count them, and it says you don't count the native tribes, separate nations within the nation, and you don't count 3/5 of all other persons. They always used a euphemism. They never actually said slaves, but we all know what they meant. So clearly they separated the slaves. They weren't to be counted, or only 3/5 of a person, in taxation and in representation as a compromise. So they're already bringing up slaves in the first article. Then you also have the contract clause. Any labor contract, any financial contract, any property contract that was established before the ratification of the Constitution was to be recognized after the Constitution. So hence, if you own slaves, sadly, we followed Rome and English common law, and slaves were movable or chattel property in the court of law. And so hence, you held that by virtue of the contract clause. Then in addition to that, you have a fugitive slave clause that specifically states anyone under terms of contract in labor who runs away is to be remanded and brought back to the owner and back to his native state. And the other states are responsible for cooperating in that. So that's another pretty explicit, instance of permitting slavery into this new federal republic. And then also you have, I know I'm forgetting one, but you have the federal structure of, and then also the 20-year gag rule. They said for 20 years, not until 1808, can you discuss ending the slave trade and bring that up as an issue and order. And granted, we did at that time, we ended the slave trade, but that did not end slavery itself, right? We were allowed them to organically reproduce and keep our supply of slaves here domestically, not to mention all the illegal trade in slaves internationally that continued long after it was legally abolished. So at any rate, then you also have the federal nature of the Constitution. And, especially when I think of like the 10th Amendment, it states, right, that whatever is not explicitly given to the federal government, or really they added kind of also implied, is to be reserved for the states. Because after all, that's the federal part of our republic, is it's supposed to be a balance between a confederacy with state autonomy and a unitary government with a strong central government. So by virtue of the 10th Amendment, some people often said that, well, nothing in Articles 1 through 3 is given to any branch that even remotely explicitly states they could end slavery in any of the states where it has been established by their state constitutions. So that's something to remember. So at any rate, and then also you think of loopholes, right? And two very obvious ones come to mind. I should know more than that, but they're the initial two that are popping in my head. Is one is eminent domain, right? The government has a right to force private property owners to sell their property for the common good. And so they are to receive the market prevailing price for their property, but they must sell that property back to the government. They could do this at the local level, state level, and federal level, right? So some people early on tinkered with that idea that they could perhaps issue an eminent domain law to the slave owners and compensate them for the price of their slaves. Then you also have the fact that a lot of the fighting that happened prior to the Civil War in public discourse pertained to the West, right? We opened up a can of worms that some people think we justly deserved in taking the far West from Mexico. And so what to do now with Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, California, and these new states that are going to apply for statehood? Are they to allow slavery? Are we to allow them to decide, et cetera, et cetera? And so Lincoln is going to grab a hold of the idea of the precedent established by the founding fathers, particularly Jefferson, with the Ohio Valley. When we had our Confederation, the Ohio Valley, like present, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, those weren't states yet. They were just claimed by the government collectively, but had not yet achieved statehood status. And what Jefferson did is he demanded that they have a public school system, and he demanded that slavery be prohibited in any of those future states up there in the North. And so people like Lincoln are going to be a little bit slow in coming around on that idea, but they're going to contend, hey, the founding fathers unilaterally made a decision to prohibit slavery in territories that weren't yet states. And so why can't we do the same with these Western territories? They're not states yet. So that's important to remember as well. And then you also have the component of treason. By virtue of the Constitution, if you have committed treason, but what complicates it is the Constitution also says that you are supposed to have received due process and been duly convicted of a crime. You could have your property confiscated. And so hence we're going to have during the war at least two property confiscation acts, whereby when the Northern Army defeated the South in a given region, they confiscated their slaves rather kind of punitively. And but then the South, what complicated it further is the South said, okay, if we are not a belligerent separate nation on paper, and we are just rebels, then we're not going to trade prisoners of war. And Lincoln didn't have the stomach for that. He wanted his prisoners of war back. He wanted to be able to trade prisoners of war. So during the war, he conceded, and for the moment, identifying the Confederacy, the 11 states of the South that left, as a separate belligerent country. So then perhaps legally that took the legs out from underneath the idea of confiscation of property of rebels. So at any rate, those are some of the things to think about as context, right, to this topic of slavery and what's to become of these new Western states as they come from territory status to state status. All right. And then also you have in Thomas Jefferson in his notes on the state of Virginia. These are letters of correspondence with a French aristocratic friend, and he gives his idea on a myriad of topics. And Madison and other friends of his put the letters together and put them into a book, and it's kind of a classic. And it makes Jefferson look very kind of enlightened for his time period, his alleged stand on these issues. And as you may recall, when he became president, there were a lot of ironies in him acting a lot more conservatively than was suggested in that book. But in that book, he tears into slavery on multiple levels. But he also contends that we can't just simplistically release the slaves. He said, right, we have the wolf by the ears and we dare not let it go. He said from years of mistreatment, and also sadly, the second part of his argument, so that hence the slaves are going to have a lot of collective resentment as far as how they've been treated. but also he had essentialist ideas about African Americans. Now, remember, if you believe, as a lot of the abolitionists will, that, you know, the whole idea of nature and nurture, if you believe that slaves are inferior environmentally, then there's always room to rectify that, right? That they're, quote, backward because they've never been given education. They've never been given any responsibility or power and had an opportunity to practice such, you know, et cetera, so that they were in such a degraded position. That's why they seem to be inferior. But when you believe in essentialist stereotypes, that they biologically, by nature, are less intelligent, they lack self-control, and that kind of ridiculous stuff, remember, that's called collectively the Sambo image. That leaves some problems, right? Because then there's no room for improvement. If you believe that they're biologically different and inferior, there's no hope, if little, if any, in trying to, quote, civilize them, and most importantly, trying to integrate with them, right? So it's one thing, people were all over the spectrum. Some people, like Lincoln, at different stages, literally called them poor creatures, right? That we need to emancipate these poor creatures. Well, okay, once you free them, then what? Well, even Lincoln and some others said integration is impossible for various reasons, for racist reasons, basically. So therefore, we need to repatriate them back to Africa. So there was a Liberian movement to try to send them back to try to advocate freeing them and then sending them back to Liberia, Africa. And the United States was purchasing land there, and the government, private churches, and other organizations were all collaborating on this idea. Then you also had those who said, well, they'll definitely form their own enclaves, right? And an enclave is like a Chinatown, right? It's an ethnically homogenous part of a city or region of a state where they're going to congregate together, all the same ethnicity, and, you know, and just kind of let them be in that manner. And so some people said, okay, we ought to give them the Roman basic first level of citizenship. We ought to allow them to have economic rights. They could buy and rent property. They have a right now to be remunerated or rewarded for their labor in the form of wages. They have a right to obtain loans, to try to start businesses, etc. So some people were okay with that first level. And then the second level, some people said, well, no, with racial discrimination as virulent and bitter as it is, they need to be protected under the law. They need to be protected by the Bill of Rights and have the right of free speech, the right to take people to court and sue them for their rights when they've been wronged, etc. And so they need basic political protection. And so some people went that further step in wanting that. And then a third step is some people would contend, no, they have the right, they've earned the right of suffrage. They ought to be able to vote, have people run for office, and participate politically in the republic. And then the final zone where very few white 19th century Americans were okay with was social integration, that they ought to be able to intermarry with white people, have children with white people, and just mix up and fully integrate socially in the republic. So at any rate, you had a myriad of things going on, all right? And then not to mention, well, I'm going to save that. I was going to say something, but it's more relevant to a subsequent number. So you have all this going on, right, to think about as far as freeing the slaves. And so then what I proceed to do is I contend that that in the South, wait, I'm mentioning the abolitionists. I didn't think I did that on number one, because I'm kind of saving that for number two. But what you notice here is when they form compromises over the West and the issue of slavery, that there developed a lot of in the 1830s through 50s, or 1820s through 50s, there developed a lot of sense of resentment in the North that the planter class of slave owners as a lobbyist group were politically becoming a bit tyrannical. That they used the term obstinate. They were stubborn. They dug their heels in and they insisted that not only they have the right to slaves, but they have the right to move west and bring the slaves with them. So you have the Missouri Compromise, and they established a line, right, the 3630 line, and said, okay, fine, Missouri can have slaves, but in the future, anywhere in the further west, because they already had reason to know long before the Mexican-American War that they would likely soon take the rest of the West to the Pacific Ocean. They said above that line, slavery will be prohibited, okay, above that 3630 line. Oh, and then also in recompense with allowing Missouri to have slaves, they separated the state of Maine from Massachusetts. They had been striving for their own statehood status for years, and they allowed it, of course, to be free. So you'd have the same number of slave states and free states. And remember that the idea tied to that is the faction thesis. And it's the idea that you don't need to know or have any kind of relationship with future slave owners in the West if you're back in Alabama, because you could count on the fact that what is good for your pocketbook, legal wise, as far as a law or policy, will be good for their pocketbook as well, because you're of the same faction. You share the same self-interest. So they're going to become, very likely, your ally. And whoever runs the numbers in Congress runs Congress and gets to make the laws of the land, right? And then likewise, if you are an entrepreneur establishing a mill or a factory, and you're paying wages to your workers, and you have someone doing the same thing in the West, he likely is going to, especially if he's in the same industry, what's good for you is going to be good for him. And he's going to become an ally to you as a Western representative in Congress. So that's important to remember as well. So at any rate, they make that agreement in 1820. And then by 1853, it's broken in the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas and Nebraska were both above the 3630 line, and they decided to allow the people of Kansas and the people of Nebraska to vote on it and decide upon it themselves. And there was a guy named Stephen Douglas, not to be misunderstood from the famous African-American runaway slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass, but this white Steve Douglas, that was his baby, so to speak. And his career climbed for the moment with that idea of popular sovereignty. The people should be in control. The people in the West themselves ought to decide what to do with slavery. So when that happened, especially in 1853, and they decided upon the vote to answer the question of slavery, and they violated their 3630 line of 1820, the Northern press called the Northern representatives in Congress dough faces. And basically they're calling them wimps, saying that they're giving in to the belligerent demands of Southern congressmen and giving these concessions, that they draw lines in the sand and they let the Southerners step over them. Then also what's important to remember from the 1820s on is a new class of people in Mississippi and Alabama. You look at a lot of their reps, like a guy named Breckinridge and others, very, very stubborn in Congress in demanding the rights of Southerners to bring their slaves to the West and those slaves to be recognized by these future Western states. And when you look at it, to historians, it makes sense, because at the end of the War of 1812 and the War with the Creeks and the Seminole Wars, the federal government gave very, very lucrative opportunities to obtain very nitrogen-rich, fertile soil in the present states of Mississippi and Alabama. And so a lot of poor white Southerners took advantage of that, and they bought land. Some of you even received it for free. down there in the deep South, as it was known. Then, in addition to that, it was like a marriage made in hell for the slaves. Is a gentleman invented short staple cotton as opposed to long staple cotton. And for reasons I don't recall, having read long ago, it was much more economically viable, profitable, this new short staple of cotton. And it grew very well in the nitrogen-rich soil of the Black Belt of Mississippi and Alabama, etc. Then in addition to that, we sadly, through illegal trade of slaves, through natural increase in numbers of slaves, and also through the diminishing economic returns of tobacco during the antebellum period. Remember, antebellum just means before the Civil War, like so 1830s through 1850s. Maryland and Virginia, they almost had to get their planters almost had to give up on tobacco. The market just plummeted that poorly. So you have primary source evidence of thousands of planters in Maryland and Virginia selling their slaves en masse to these new slave owners into the Deep South. And with the slaves, with their narratives of music and songs, we have evidence of them, contending that the march down into the Deep South to them was like hell on earth. Because firstly, a lot of them were separated from family members, but they also had a strong foreboding of things to come. That dealing with cotton was going to be especially egregious work down there in the Deep South. And then, of course, you had the cotton gin, and that gave the incentive to people because it was so much more efficient as a machine in extracting the black seeds from the sticky cotton than anyone could by hand, that it made the process much cheaper and much quicker, much more efficient, and thereby more profitable. And so, but I didn't finish my thought, is that with those circumstances in slaves, they experienced, sadly, it sounds horrible to use that term because most historians will put it in quotations, but they experienced a glut in the slave market, where there were actually more slaves than there was demand for them. And of course, what happens, even though these are human beings, with any, quote, property whereby the supply exceeds the demand, the price plummets. So slaves also became cheap or affordable at this time in the antebellum period. So again, another reason why these Southerners were moving down, poor white ambitious Southerners moving down into the Deep South, buying land or receiving land, and purchasing slaves and a cotton gin, etc. So at any rate, the idea is the term they use for them derisively is parvenu, Parvenu. And a parvenu is like a Beverly Hillbilly. It's someone who has historically, generationally been poor, and they suddenly find themselves in a business that renders them nouveau riche. They're new rich, right? And so the idea is you get a poor demographic that gets a taste of the material good life and becomes rich rather quickly. They are going to fight to the death to maintain that newfound privileged lifestyle. So the derisive term used for the reps that were elected in their regions was fire eaters, because they would not compromise. They made demands, and they stuck to those demands to try to not only maintain the perseverance of the institution of slavery, but to try to spread it. Okay. And so with that, an example of their stubbornness is what they began to do is their congressmen would make demands upon other fellow Democrats, especially the Northern Democrats. And they would say, if you don't take a stronger stand for the right of property owners to maintain their, quote, property, their slaves, and for that to be extended into the West, then we're not going to vote with you on other key issues that are important to you as your allies. So they made ultimatums to fellow Democrats and tried to put the pressure on them to be rather aggressive in protecting the rights of not only slavery, but its dissemination, its spreading to the West. So on number one, I'm more than suggesting that diplomacy was likely not possible, that the way that the Southern Democratic lobbyist powers that be behaved in Congress, the way the parvenus represented in Congress in the Deep South were, they weren't going to compromise. And so I'm suggesting very subjectively that a war had to be fought. All right. Any questions on number one? All right. So then in addition to that, so you see the 3630 line there, and you see the Confederacy at the bottom and the North. And it's not including California and other states that added up to 19, the blue states for the Yankees in the North. So that map actually isn't entirely accurate. So at any rate, moving on to number two, court history. Here we go. All right. The first thing that I notice in old court history books is they try to make the claim that in the antebellum period, there arose an exceptional class. All right. An exceptional generation. All right. And very simple in how they claimed they were exceptional is that they were unusually idealistic. I mean, when you're idealistic, you don't see the world as it is, you see it as it ought to be. You want to change and improve man, institutions, culture, etc., and improve them. And that's exactly what you could find in some of these movements, these myriad of movements, these antebellum reform movements that sprung up at this time. All right. So for one, why, before we even get into, support for that idea of an exceptional generation that was predominantly in the North, why would that be? If people just try to borrow from sociology and they have some just practical guesses, if you will. So for one, you have the beginnings and stirrings of the Industrial Revolution in the North. And a lot of those changes, especially breaking up the nuclear family of mom, dad, and the kids, and having young adolescent kids go to work in a mill, go to school for an increasing number of years, etc. The skilled workers slowly having their jobs kind of usurped, taken over by machine production and being outproduced and outsold by their manufacturing rivals. That there, as there always are, there were disruptions, there were dislocations involved in the Industrial Revolution. And so people began to try to look for a semblance of order, a semblance of belonging, etc., in such kind of disorienting times. So some people make that argument. That's kind of the most popular one that I come across when they contend that there was an exceptional generation that arose at this time. You had a lot of them were designed to address practical problems. So you also, along with the Industrial Revolution, had westward migration, overland westward migration that we've already just covered. And then also urbanization. Some of the northeastern cities began to really grow in numbers. And their infrastructure wasn't prepared for those numbers. So suddenly they had an increase in, littering, crime, sewage problems, etc. So they had practical issues to address, along with these changes that were being brought about, not only industrially, but demographically, with cities growing up and people moving to the West. And so at any rate, for whatever reasons, they contend that this generation was special. So for one, right, it was an axiom. It was an assumption that you didn't question, is you don't take the congressional floor, you don't go to the press, you don't engage in a public debate and take on the morality of slavery. It was just taboo. It just was for multiple generations. And now some had made the economic arguments that, if you don't pay your slaves and they lose all hope of ascendance, of being able to move up the economic and social pyramid, they're not going to work hard. They're going to naturally lose hope and become lazy workers. So you had arguments like that slavery was economically not the optimal mode of production for reasons, obvious reasons like that. You had people take on that issue before. But again, just simply to say that slavery was a sin, a crime against humanity, you just didn't do it. You just didn't go there. Well, this generation did. All right, this generation did. So you have reform movements in the cities against crime, for better police establishments, for public school, to make public schooling universal throughout their entire states. You had the temperance movement against alcohol. You had the child labor movement against employing children, especially in the mines. You had just a myriad of reforms. You had a prison reform. Dorothy Dix became famous because she was indignant that they were putting in prisons people who had psychiatric issues that perhaps were like schizophrenic, etc. They didn't know what to do with them, and they'd put them in prisons without having ever committed a crime. So she established the first, quote, asylum movement for those with psychological ailments. And again, just there's a long list of these different types of reforms that went on. Within the churches, the Protestant churches, you had a second Great Awakening, and they were very anti-establishment. They didn't like the fact that they could only have pastors who had been Ivy League educated. They said that they were almost too intellectual, too dry, etc. So you had this movement that really stressed emotion, having a born again experience with Jesus, being born again, and wanting commoners to lead them in their congregations, etc. And then also they went against the idea of Calvinism. Calvinism stressed predestination, that man is so wretched that he can't even begin to accept Christ on his own volition. And God has to choose, God chose before time who he was going to reveal himself to and move to conversion, and who he wouldn't. They greatly challenged that and said that all human beings were made in God's image and have an equal opportunity for salvation. And it's their choice if they want to accept Christ as their savior. So at any rate, a lot of these movements kind of were anti-establishment, kind of egalitarian, right? Everyone on equal footing. And what better example of that than, and then also you had the Unitarian Church. And that ruffled a lot of feathers, because even these other evangelical reformers still believed that Jesus was the only way to heaven. And the Unitarians said that there are multiple paths to heaven, and Jesus is just one of them. And so a lot of intellectuals who thought Christianity was too dogmatic, they went to the Unitarian Church. And so you had that going on. but also the Transcendentalists, right? The Transcendentalists took from Native American pantheism, they took from Indian Hinduism, and they took from Asian Buddhism the ideas, some of their fundamental ideas, and then they kind of made their own American worldview out of all of it. And what they contended, right, was that man is no better than an animal if all he does is just work to earn food, to feed his family, and to go back to work, and to go on that hamster wheel, chasing after an ever elusive American dream, and then dies. They said, you must transcend your material existence, your animal-like existence, and reach for something much higher. And so they said, for one, they were really into self-cultivation. They thought that all human beings, and they meant all, ought to be able to be free to have the leisure and the time and the opportunity to go to school and receive the schooling that they crave after, right? And to learn about new cultures, etc., and the hard and the social sciences. They said also that mankind ought to be free for introspection, to have time of like meditation, and to meditate on eternal things, etc. So they were very kind of spiritual that way. They kind of, I don't mean to make it sound silly, but they were kind of like intellectual hippies. And they had women, they had immigrants, and others that were warmly welcomed into their communes. And they would try these utopian communes. Remember, utopia means no place because it's too good to be true. They tried to find establish these environments that would help people transcend. And they had it down to like an enlightenment type science. You'd have a certain number of hours of study and learning new things, a certain number of hours of manual labor, because that was good for your body and soul, and exercise, a certain number of hours of altruistic cooperation, of serving one another, that was good for your soul, to lose your own egotism and lose yourself in a larger number of people. So much time also of isolation for meditation and all of that by yourself, etc. And so they would put it down to a science, and they were so open to novelty that some of the most famous communes did not even recognize nuclear families. So if husband and wife and kids came in there, they were not recognized as such. And so the husband and wife might procreate with someone else, etc. So you can imagine, to like traditional conservative people, how they were just aghast at how radical these transcendentalists were. All right. Henry David Thoreau, right, going to leaving Concord, Massachusetts, and living out in the wilderness. And he was bored by his Harvard education. He thought it was too stilted, and he wanted to look beyond that. And ultimately, the Transcendentalists thought that like as with Buddhism, that your soul could meet with the collective oversoul that connects all things at death if you reach enlightenment. So at any rate, to the Transcendentalists, to the antebellum reformers, they did not care what tradition stated. They didn't care what the leaders of the institutions, like the churches and government and family heads of households, what they said. They were there to rock the boat. They were there to challenge and, quote, improve all of this. So then it shouldn't be surprising that you had amongst them abolitionists. And the abolitionists were radical in a few ways. For one, they didn't spend a whole lot of their intellectual effort into trying to share with Americans a constitutional way out of the slavery problem, right? Like we talked about earlier. like maybe using eminent domain, or maybe claiming that the Western territories cannot have slavery because the founding fathers had done that in Ohio. They almost didn't even have time for that. To them, right? Because they were for nonviolent civil disobedience, especially Henry David Thoreau. They had a notion that there are natural laws in the universe of right and wrong, and they pretty much adhere to the golden rule of Jesus that, you know, you treat others as you'd want them to treat you. And so there are higher natural laws, and then there are man-made government civic laws that sometimes get it right with natural laws and sometimes get it wrong. And to them, with slavery, the state and the federal governments had gotten it wrong clearly. And so they didn't worry about the niceties of political minutia. They just said it's wrong, it's immoral, and so we don't care what the Constitution does or does not say, does or does not permit. We're taking it on. And of course, William Lloyd Garrison put up a copy of the Constitution in front of a large crowd, and he burnt it, saying that the founding fathers made a deal with the devil in allowing slavery, and we should defy the Constitution. And he was almost killed for it. So at any rate, you have that element that made them radical. Secondly, clearly, they were willing to take on slavery as a moral issue, not just an economic or political issue. They clearly thought it was immoral. And then thirdly, some, not all, but some of the abolitionists went the whole way across the spectrum to the left of change. They wanted political enfranchisement of slaves once they were freed. They wanted cultural integration and social integration with the freedmen, the ex-slaves. Like I said, not all of them, but many of the most well-known. All right. So you have these people, right, who are making a lot of waves, and they're forcing the country to have debate, to have discourse on the topic. They're not giving the country a choice. They're deliberately making waves, and they're proud of it. All right. And remember, they had the written word. You had the development of the cylindrical rotary press, the steam-powered press, and now they could put out production of newspapers in such high quantity that they could sell them for a penny, and it became known as the penny press. So the average person could afford them and could read them. And there was enough public school education, especially throughout the North, where people could read at least a third, fourth grade level and read what was written in these newspapers. Then you also had the women wrote sentimental novels. And of course, the most famous was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she makes Uncle Tom out to be a Christ-like figure, right? He's big and strong. He has opportunities to run away, and to rebel, and to hurt his overseer, and he chooses to take the high road. He tells the other slaves not to rebel, not to run away, to bide their time, to obey. And they disobey him. And when caught, he takes the blame for them, even though he had nothing to do with it. And he's punished in their place. And he's virtually whipped to death. And in his dying breath, he forgives the cruel overseer who was killing him. And, it's hard there are no polls at that time. It's hard to gauge the percentage of the population that was affected by these dime novels, but supposedly they sold in very high numbers. There was a lot of political discourse on them, especially her book, and it was even mentioned quite often in Congress. And Lincoln, not that this is definitive proof, but it's something to think about. Abraham Lincoln met her, and he clasped supposedly both her hands, and he bent over to her face, smiling, and he said, "So you're the little lady who started this war." And so that's the kind of credit he gave to her book alone. So you have the written word, that was going in mass, to the people. And then and then also with the press, you had people like, oh gosh, I have them named in here. Shame on me for forgetting their name. There were two brothers in New York, very, very wealthy, and they flooded the South with anti-slavery literature. And the Southern congressmen were furious and tried to get a congressional law passed for to forbid the post office from sending that type of propaganda into the South. Because, of course, they were afraid that it was going to encourage a slave rebellion, a mass slave rebellion, right? Shoot, that's bothering me, not remembering their names. But at any rate, you had that going on as well. And then, of course, the spoken word. You had these things called lyceums. They had been begun by Aristotle in Athens. They were intellectual fairs, right? You'd pay a small fee and you would come in and you would listen to an expert in one field after another lecture about that topic. And so especially with the low instances of opportunity to go to college for the average person at this time, this was the next best thing. So they became very in vogue throughout the North to go to these lyceums. Well, abolitionists used those lyceums. So you had the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelique. And they had run away from their dad in South Carolina, and they had a bunch of horror stories as to how the slaves on their plantation, in their home, were mistreated. And then, of course, arguably the most famous was Frederick Douglass. He was secretly given an education by what may have been his half sisters, because he was the product, we believe, of raping from a white father to his black slave mother. And because she would no longer give in to his overtures, or perhaps never did, he vindictively sold her son Frederick from her. And she would run away, find him. The young white half sisters would hide him and her in a large cupboard, and she would sing and kiss him and cry until she had to leave. And eventually she stopped coming. And I remember by the third time of being caught without your papers, you were to be executed. He had a story of a developmentally stunted slave who had a big, strong body, but he said the brain of a child. And he was told to they were told to get in the river to bathe because they were sweaty and muddy by the overseer. And then he tells them to get out. And the man with the developmental issues was having such a good time in the river with the water that he was slow to get out. And Frederick Douglass felt responsible for him because Frederick Douglass knew not only did he have a secret education, but he was just a very intelligent man. So he had a sense of responsibility over this big guy. And he literally stepped in between, begged the overseer to understand that he's not rebelling. He's just enjoying himself. And despite that, the overseer shot him in the head and killed him. His blood and brain matter went upon the neck and the shirt of Frederick Douglass. He told Frederick Douglass to wash his shirt and replace it. And Frederick Douglass would not. Said, I want everybody to see what you did. And he was whipped for it, and he didn't care. So at any rate, he runs away. He starts a circuit, and he was just powerful as a speaker and putting the crowds to tears. He went to London. He was beloved in England. An abolitionist society collectively raised easily enough money to pay his market worth to his ex-master, because the ex-master was paying people to try to find him and remand him back. So at any rate, you had lyceums and you had the spoken word as well that were going on. And then if that's not enough, you had some who were pretty much abolitionists, because a lot of the abolitionists, right, they were for moral persuasion, to change people's hearts, to change the culture, right? So very few of them, the big ones that I've been talking about lately, were actually involved in a political office. But with this paragraph here, you see they're developed a sizable minority group of Republican congressmen who were just about as radical as the abolitionists. You had Charles Sumner, Henry Wilson, John Andrew, Charles Francis Adams, Thaddeus Stevens was a big one, David Wilmot, Benjamin Wade was big. Joshua Giddings had the ear of Abraham Lincoln and supposedly helped move Lincoln toward a more militant stance against slavery when they were bunkmates in Congress. Salmon Chase, that guy had a bounty from the South on his head, because Salmon Chase, he took it a step further, is he started a campaign throughout the South telling white Southern poor people to stop voting in the planter class, that they were not their allies, that they did not care for them, that they derisively called them crackers and thought just as lowly of them as they did as of their own Negro slaves, and that they needed to pretty much have a new class of poor, proletariat, white Southerners voting in their own into Congress. And so to a lot of Southerners, they thought that Salmon Chase was trying to foment class rebellion in the white South. All right. And so they began playing the Southerners' game. They began telling the moderate Republicans, all right, moderate Republicans, you're pro big business. We know that. You want tariffs to protect our beginning industries from the European rivals, right? You want to be subsidized by the federal government and the U.S. Bank in bringing up new industries. Well, we're not going to vote with you on those economic issues if you don't take a stronger stance against slavery, particularly in spreading to the West. You need to help us say no, not allow slavery to spread any further to the West. And then also there was the idea, right, that that if they would, this was almost embraced by both sides, that if slavery were not allowed to grow, right, organically and spread naturally to the West, that somehow that would bring about its demise, that it needed more land, more allies, etc. And I've never fully understood that assumption, as opposed to being kind of a slippery slope argument, but it was embraced in the North and South. And so hence part of the reason why it was such a make or break issue on whether they would allow slavery to spread to the West or not. All right. So Joshua Giddings gave his American Infidelity speech, and a lot of Southerners left the Congressional Hall when he was giving it. Owen Lovejoy supposedly gave one that was even more radical and caused an uproar. And then Charles Sumner made fun of the Southern planters, likened them to Don Quixote de la Mancha. I remember Don Quixote was dealing with dementia as an elderly Spaniard and thought he was a chivalric knight fighting knight errands, always defending those who couldn't defend themselves. And remember, he goes into a brothel and he sees a prostitute and he says, that is my virgin, chaste queen, Dulcinea. And how dare this man put her on his lap as they share a drink? And he challenged the man for her chastity and her innocence and all that, clearly oblivious to the fact that she was choosing to be there as a prostitute, etc. And he made that allusion to the Southerners, that slaves were their Dulcinea, that they thought having slaves made them look prestigious but to the North and everyone else, they look like fools and rascals. And at any rate, he called out one particular senator, and the Northerners laughed at that man. And the senator's nephew was a House rep. Word spread to him. He came to the Senate chambers. His name was Preston Brooks, and he almost beat Charles Sumner to death with his cane. And remember, the idea in the Southern gentry class is you use a cane on your social inferiors. They don't deserve to fill your fist. They're beneath you. So you use a cane instead. So at any rate, he almost caned to death Charles Sumner. So at any rate, things are getting very, very divisive throughout the country, in Congress, but largely because, according to this account, because the North finally developed a generation that was defiant enough, idealistic enough, brave enough to take this issue head on. All right. Like I say here, they picked a fight that needed to be fought. And then in addition to that, you had events that happened in the 1850s that historians believe had a polarizing effect. And remember, like with polarization, with magnetism and so forth, they had an effect of just pushing people to one side or another, that you could almost no longer be indifferent. You increasingly felt an emotional instinct and a societal need to pick a side, because things were becoming so dramatically confrontational. So a couple examples of that, I'll try to be quick with this. One was the Fugitive Slave Clause of the 1850 Compromise of allowing California to be free state in 1850. You had an episode in Syracuse, New York. A black man was at a black church, and a team of men who were wanting to get paid the bounty for returning him surrounded the church. And when he came out, his church brethren refused to give him over, and they surrounded him to protect him, and a riot ensued. Then shortly after that, 2 or 3 northern states issued liberty laws, saying basically they would not cooperate in the Fugitive Slave Act. They would not use any of their police forces, and would not even encourage their people to return runaway slaves. So things are getting dramatic now, right? Then also, as I mentioned, with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they decided to have like popular referendums to let the people decide in these 2 states. Well, when they had their vote in Kansas, people flooded from the New England states to vote against it. They came all the way to Kansas just for this vote. And people flooded from the South to come and do the same, but the opposite, obviously. And so there was a lot of ballot stuffing, people voting multiple times, dead people voting, etc. So both sides contend that they won, that the other side cheated, and it was left over to the federal government to decide. And according to this thesis, court history is the 3 presidents before Lincoln, they just didn't have the stomach. They didn't have the backbone or the courage to take the South on. They wanted to placate the South to avoid civil war. And so at this time, it was Pierce, Franklin Pierce, and then after him, inheriting this problem, was Buchanan. And they were both Northerners, but they were Democrats, and they didn't want to make enemies of their Democratic foes or their Democratic allies in the South. So they recognized the Lecompton group that claimed slavery was legal in Kansas, and the anti-slavery side in Topeka refused to step down. So the Lecompton group sent a military group to Topeka, told them to leave the premises of their Capitol building, step down. They lost on the issue. Slavery was now legal. They were not the legal government. They refused, and thus ensued a mini civil war in Kansas. known as Bleeding Kansas. And so there you have it. Is, Stephen Douglas had this supposedly great compromise idea that let the people themselves in the Western territories decide on slavery. Well, that didn't work, obviously, in Kansas, at least. It just led to bloodshed. So that's going on. And then you also had the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And again, this is the white racist Southerner Stephen Douglas, not Frederick Douglass, who's running for senator against Lincoln in Illinois. And they talk about Kansas. They talk about slavery in the West. And by this time, Lincoln has finally come around. And he said that slavery is immoral. It's morally wrong. That the founding fathers intended future generations to eventually end it. And that the way to end it was to keep it from spreading in the West. And that by virtue of the Northwest Ordinances in Ohio from Thomas Jefferson, Congress had every right to say no to the entire Western territories on slavery, and that he would do just that if he were elected into the Senate. And Stephen Douglas set him up in front of a white racist libertarian crowd and said, so you're telling me that if you had the power single-handedly, that if everyone in Kansas voted for slavery, you by yourself unilaterally would say no to that entire state of people because you think it's immoral? And Lincoln stuck with his guns and said, yes, I would. He said, we do not have a democracy. We have a republic. The founding fathers deliberately put certain offices in that were not elected. And he said, this should not be left to the people on a vote. And so from those debates, Lincoln became known as the tyrant, right? Who by himself would prohibit slavery in all the Western territories. So then in addition to that, you had the Dred Scott case, which I'll get into in just a moment. But that was a very strong decision made on behalf of the South in defending the rights of Southerners bringing their slaves to the West or anywhere for that matter, and having their property safely protected. And so the North was outraged by the Dred Scott case. And then also John Brown's raid. John Brown, with like 19 or 21 men, went into Harper's Ferry, Virginia, attacked the federal fort, killed the officers, and tried to disseminate the guns in that fort to the local slaves to start a slave insurrection. This literally was the white South's living nightmare, right? Trying to materialize. So the federal government, not just the state of Virginia, brought in federal troops, surrounded a famous barn, killed two of his boys, shot him, and he was put on a very, very publicized trial and hanged for insurrection in the state of Virginia. So a lot of these events, right, were just so polarizing. They were almost making people choose a side. And then the last missing piece for court history in explaining the end of slavery is the evolution of Abraham Lincoln. And I believe that's coming up soon. Lincoln, supposedly just in time, evolves into having enough moral indignation, enough political courage to do what he could do in his position to help end slavery. Okay, so that's court history. Any questions? All right, number 3 is revisionist. And it tries to poke holes throughout that entire thesis that I just covered. The first thing they do in revisionist history very often, like Howard Zinn in his book and so forth, is they show the evidence of just horrible racism in the North as well as in the South. So I mentioned about 19 northern states, only 5 of those 19 northern states gave some African-American men some citizenship rights. 5 out of 19. During the war, abolitionists tried to move, right, work on the the mood of the time, right? Of the anti-South sentiment, because they're literally at war with them. In 3 states, they issued referendums, popular votes on enfranchising, giving citizenship to the black men. 2 of the 3 states, it failed. That's during the war, while they're supposedly fighting to end slavery. All right. Then you also have the fact that there was a lot of issues that went alongside the slavery issue that may have been bigger to the contemporaries than the slave issue. So for one is the faction thesis, right? Is to some of the big Republican moderate leaders in the North, they promised their voters no jobs to the Negroes, no slavery. We want industrial jobs in the West open to white men who will be paid wages and allowed opportunities for advancement. So generically, they were known as the free soilers. They didn't care about African Americans. They didn't address all those things mentioned by the abolitionists. They wanted jobs for white men. And then the plantations, if they have to exist and spread to the West, they wanted the plantations to offer jobs to white sharecroppers who would rent portions of the planters' property and receive a portion of the profit, usually up to a third, for doing the work. So you could oppose slavery for all the wrong reasons. Then you also had just anger toward the slaveocracy, as they called it, wanting to put the planting class of the South in its place, period. And that'll be connected in the future to Dunning's thesis, which we'll get into soon. And then conversely, in the South, right, there's an interesting book called Life of Johnny Reb. And in it, you have some evidence, some primary source evidence of interviews during the war. And some very clever journalists at times, and very direct journalists, basically told these Confederate foot soldiers, they said, hey, man, you're not getting a penny from the slave planters' profit revenue. You could be given a job as a sharecropper instead of those slaves. Why are you fighting for this rich slave owner who cares nothing for you? Why are you risking your life for him? And quite a few of them evidently said, oh, we could care less. We despise many of the slave owners. But we don't believe that big government in DC should tell Alabama what to do about anything, including slavery. So hence, some in the South were fighting simply for libertarianism, for the federal government to stay unobtrusively out of their state's business, period. And then you also had the treatment of the African Americans by the Northern Army during the war. As I mentioned, there were 2 confiscation acts issued by Northern Congress. And when they issued them, they were very rough with, and by the way, oftentimes in the primary sources, they called them refugees, contraband, and other kind of rather dehumanizing terms, like they were an annoyance to the Northern Army because they were slowed down in their movement by these exodus of these runaway slaves and these captured slaves in areas that they had militarily won in the South. They gave them jobs that no one else wanted to do. They forced them to dig the latrines for the men to go to the bathroom in, to bury the dead, to cook and clean, to wash clothes, etc. And then you look at the hesitance throughout a lot of these Northern congressmen uh, officers in the Union Army and the common foot soldiers, there was a large kind of combination of suspicion and disdain toward African Americans at the thought of them helping them as soldiers. The whole wolf by the ear thing. They thought, are you kidding me? The way that these Black men have been treated for generations and their entire lives, we're going to put a gun in their hand? What's going to stop them from turning side to side and shooting and killing us? You had in the North notions of the Sambo image, that the Black soldiers are going to be cowards, they're going to be lazy, etc. So hence, right, according to revisionist, this simplistic dichotomy between an enlightened, idealistic North fighting to end slavery against a backward, immoral South does not even remotely give due justice to the complexity of all this. All right. And by the way, the reformers, the abolitionists, etc. The abolitionists have been computed by historians. I don't know how they could come up with numbers, but they try. And I'm sure they don't just they don't bring these numbers up out of nowhere. They contend they think the abolitionists comprised about 2.5% of the Northern population. 2.5%. Because after all, the very moderate Lincoln, early in his life, that was kind of his first baby step, is he fought for the protection of abolitionists to speak their mind, to be entitled to their First Amendment rights. Because one northern state after another were issuing laws saying that if you engage in insightful rhetoric, and everybody knew what insightful was, that was abolitionist rhetoric, that you do it at the peril of your own life and property. And this is in the North. So Elijah Lovejoy, all the way up in Ohio, he was murdered by a mob for his abolitionist newspaper. William Lloyd Garrison was hanged from a light pole and saved from asphyxiation by the police. And these are Northerners against these abolitionists. And then I do some great man history that's very cynical against Lincoln. See, Lincoln, in his first inaugural speech, he says, South, please don't leave the Union. Please don't start this war. Because what is he kind of saying, right? He's like, come on, I'm not going to just let you leave and split up this republic that we have, not without a fight. So he's like, please don't leave. Don't start a civil war. And he says, I have neither the constitutional right nor even the personal inclination to interfere with slavery where it already exists, like in the states of Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama. He says, I'm only not going to allow it to spread anywhere to the West. All right. Then he cuts a deal with the Upper South. See, Tennessee and Missouri, especially, and Virginia, because West Virginia is going to split over the issue and form its newfound state. But in those three states, it was literally neighbor against neighbor, because they're literally caught between the North and the South geographically. And being in that space geographically allowed, through the evolution of human decisions and historical events, there to be some kind of Yankee sentiment in those states and some Southern sentiment and cultural and traditions in those states. You had certain areas that were very mountainous and filled with poor white subsistence farmers growing their own food. Couldn't afford slave if they wanted one. And then you had these other plateau areas with large estates with tons of slaves on them. So economics were involved. So at any rate, it was like mini civil war, especially in Missouri, in these states. So Lincoln tells mainly those states he had in mind. And he said, if you choose the Union and fight for my army instead of the South, I'll let you keep your slaves. Then when he issued his Emancipation Proclamation, who did it declare free? The slaves of rebels. All right. And then in addition to that, you had a guy named George Julian. He had given 2 speeches in the Senate as an abolitionist himself, trying to appeal to the humanitarianism of the Northern Congress, of the Northern Senate, to free the slaves, to allow them to prove their merit in battle. Because he firmly believed that once they fought for the Union, that in a lot of even racist minds would earn them at least basic political rights after the war in the minds of Americans. But he got a terrible and hostile response from fellow Northerners in Senate both times. So supposedly he gives a more famous third one. And he gets up and he's rather patronizing. And he pretty much says, I know I'm ahead of my generation. I know I can't appeal to your heart. So I'm gonna hit you where it counts, where it works. He said, the South is getting desperate enough that either we or the South are going to take the initiative and beat the other to the punch in using slaves as soldiers. Because it really was a very precarious balance throughout this 4-year war. It was very uncertain for quite a long time as to who was going to win. He says, secondly, Black soldiers will, fighting against the South, will give hope to the Black slaves and communities in the South, and it'll encourage them to rebel, and it'll be a great divide and conquer tactic. And he said, thirdly, it will have a great psychological effect and give a great psychological blow to the white South because of their guilty conscience of how they've treated the slaves. They said they'll tremble in their boots when they see Black soldiers coming from them, well armed and in uniform. And you also have quotes from Ulysses Grant, the war hero of the North, as well as Lincoln, on the utility, the usefulness of using Black soldiers. Very akin to what George Julian said. So according to Howard Zinn, these other historians, right, that the Civil War was about all kinds of stuff. It was not a crusade, especially in that simplistic dichotomy of a good North and a bad South, a progressive North and a backward South. And he said, they finally emancipated the slaves because of the organic evolution of events. Things just organically happened that direction. And that when they became desperate enough, and then one more factor they often use is the Emancipation Proclamation, it gave a newfound sense of purpose to the war. Because so many men had died up to that point, that to the North, to a lot of people in the North, this was the War of Secession. They were all dying just to keep the South from leaving the country. And that wasn't good enough to a lot of Northerners. That wasn't worth so many lives. Like, the heck with the South, let them go. But now, right, supposedly this is going to give the North momentum and a sense of purpose, a newfound purpose at this low ebb of the war. and stating that they're going to emancipate the slaves so that the Northern soldiers didn't die for nothing. And then also when we issued the Emancipation Proclamation, England backed off of signing a treaty of alliance with the Confederacy. Because remember, England had a strong lobbyist power for textile manufacturers, and they loved themselves some Southern cotton. So that gave great economic and political advantage to the South in getting the sympathy of England. But when Lincoln even partially made the war out to be publicly about slavery and ending it with the Emancipation Proclamation, the English diplomats just backed off because they were ahead of us in abolitionist sentiment. And they weren't about to publicly endorse a country, the Confederacy, that overtly was fighting to keep slavery. They just weren't going to do that. So that was very shrewd of Lincoln. So at any rate, something to think about. And then, of course, you had the New York draft riots. They came in. You could pay, shame on me for not remembering if it was $30 or $300. But whatever it was a lot of money back then. It was one of those two. You pay a certain amount of money and you can get someone to fight in your stead. So some of the wealthy business elite in the North, that's what they did. So at this draft riot, they attacked wealthy houses, but they also attacked Black orphanages and Black neighborhoods and lynched Black people, chanting, "We're not dying for the N-words." So much for that simple, narrative. And remember, as with any topic we do, there could be some truth to each of these. That doesn't fully abrogate number one, but it certainly adds complexity to it. And then number four, Abraham Lincoln has alleged evolution into an American saint. Basically in this one, he came around, he evolved, okay, personally and intellectually. All right. According to his own attestation, he was indifferent about slavery as a young man. It didn't touch his life. He grew up in Indiana and then Illinois. His church split over the issue, but he admits he didn't care. But then in 1838 and in 1841, he takes trips down the Mississippi as a flat boatsman, taking the farm produce of a rich farmer and as the middleman going down to New Orleans to sell it, bring back the revenue and get a share of that for his work. He went down with his cousin John Hanks and he sees slaves in shackles. And it's tough because we're talking 1838 and 1841, right? His words about it are spoken in an interview decades later. But decades later, he said that it affected his sleep, that it had, this is somewhat of a direct quote, the power of making him feel miserable, constantly thinking about what he saw. And so he starts off simply defending as a lawyer in Illinois the rights of abolitionists to their First Amendment. Then he gets elected into the House and he boards with Joshua Giddings. And supposedly Joshua Giddings was pretty instrumental in helping to bring him about to somewhat of a change. And by the way, in his defense, much sooner than this, he wrote down these personal notes that have survived. And note what I haven't read there. He said that he felt that constitutionally, intellectually, the North didn't have much of a leg to stand on. and ending slavery where it already is established in the southern states. But he said, in order that we have to, like Henry Clay said, we have to crucify our feelings. We know morally that it's repugnant, but we have to compromise in order to keep the South together with us. But look what he wrote here to himself. If A can prove, however conclusively, that he may have right enslaved B, why may not B snatch the same argument, even prove equally that he may enslave A? Oh, you say A is white and B is black. Is it color then, the lighter having the right to enslave the darker? Take care. By this rule, you are to be the slave to the first man you meet with a fairer skin than your own. Oh, you do not mean color exactly. You mean that whites are intellectually superior to blacks and therefore have the right to enslave them. Take care again. By this rule, you are to become the slave of the first man you meet with an intellect superior to your own. So he had a way of demonstrating kind of early on an evolving personal antagonism to slavery, a repugnance for it. But as far as outwardly making a decision, no. Well, finally, however, when he gets into the house, Joshua Giddings has his ear, and Joshua Giddings tells him, well, he convinced him to what he's going to eventually embrace intellectually, the intellectual change that needed to happen. And that was that the founding fathers knew they were making a deal with the devil, and they gave subtle hints and had a hope and expectation that future generations, when the time was more ripe, were gonna end this immoral institution. So he says, as a symbol, we ought to end slavery in Washington, D.C., because, as you know, according to the Constitution, it has its own federal jurisdiction that Congress has over it. And that ought to be a symbol to the nation that slavery's days are numbered. So that was kind of his first baby step. And but then what begins to change is he supposedly becomes more and more convinced that the South is no longer playing by the rules. And the rules were established by Henry Clay and his generation is compromise, 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 right? And as he became more and more convinced that the South was being aggressive, obstinate, he said, fine, then we have the right to become aggressive and obstinate. And supposedly, a couple events were very big in doing that and convincing him that the time was increasingly coming to get tougher on the South. One was Bleeding Kansas. He thought that was a fiasco. He thought it never should have gone to a popular vote. And that shortly thereafter, right, in his Lincoln-Douglas debates, he states that. And states that someone at DC needs to just say no to the entire West. But what was bigger to him, according to his own interviews and writings, was the Dred Scott decision. So look at this. The Dred Scott decision cited two fundamental arguments: that the founding fathers were not hypocrites in claiming all men are created equal in the Declaration, but that they didn't mean to include African Americans as men, as human. Therefore, the founding fathers never intended African Americans to be citizens entitled to citizenship rights anywhere in the Union. Secondly, that the U.S. Constitution obligated the federal government to protect citizens' property anywhere under U.S. jurisdiction, including federal territories in the West and even free soil states in the North. The latter argument created a concern in Lincoln that the slave power as a lobbyist force would not be content until not only the entire West must permit slavery, but perhaps also even the northern free states if an exodus of slaveholders were to move there. So supposedly the Dred Scott decision was huge in Lincoln's life and convincing him that we don't have to compromise anymore. The South is, you can't reason with them. You can't compromise with them. It's all or nothing. So hence he gave his House Divided speech after that point, where he said, he quoted Jesus, "House divided against itself cannot stand. We're either going to become one, or all the other." That made him look like a radical in the South. So then during the war, he made it clear from the get-go, the West is off limits. He himself as president, and he was hoping Congress as well, were not allowing any future states in the Western territories to allow slavery. And he even admitted that he felt in doing that, the slavery as an institution would then die out like a gangrenous limb. So he's taking a stronger stance. And then as far as his compromise with Kentucky, right? There's a little bit you could use, and maybe there is an emotional side to me from my childhood that wants to defend Lincoln. And so keep that in mind. But he was approached by his Secretary of State, who was an abolitionist, who he put in his cabinet, William Seward. When he found out about the deal made with the Middle South and keeping their slaves, he threatened to quit. Lincoln sits him down and he gives him basically a chess analogy. He says, "Listen, I have to triage here." He says, firstly, the abolitionist who ran for office, he says, let's look at John C. Fremont. Let's look at you, who ran against me as well as an abolitionist in 1860, and John C. Fremont before us in 1856 as an ardent, diehard abolitionist. He said, "How did you guys do running for office?" And Seward got quiet because he knew they were destroyed in the polls. Being abolitionist was not popular. So he says, firstly, I have to look more moderate, more unconcerned about slavery than I really am. And he says, I can't do anything if I'm not reelected in 1864. And he said, the Northern Democrats are running a great campaign saying that all these boys are fighting for nothing, are fighting and dying for nothing, that they should just let the South leave as a separate country. And so he said, I have to appear moderate or I'm not going to stay in office. He says, secondly, what good can I do if we lose the war? And he said, I need Kentucky. He said, I need their men. I need their resources that could help tip the balance in this war. I need them. And he tells them what they don't know is, he said, they're keeping their slaves until I no longer need them. He says, they can keep their slaves for now. He says, but once I no longer need Kentucky's help, I'm emancipating their slaves. They just don't know it yet. And in defense of Lincoln, he did. He gave them a letter. He gave them 2 letters to the legislature of Kentucky. And the second one is the famous one. He says, guys, I've offered this to you one time, and this is the final time I'm offering it. He said, I am forever grateful for your military help. And for that, I want to reward you. So for the second and final time, I'm offering you an opportunity of gradual, compensated emancipation. He says, I'm not giving that offer to anybody in the South that's stubbornly fighting against me. I'm going to take their slaves from them and not give them a penny. But I'm wanting to do this for you, for your loyalty. But if you say no again, I'm going to treat you no differently from the rest of the South, and I'm just going to take your slaves. So do you want to get paid for them or not? And they stubbornly said no, again, the second time. So they did not receive compensation. But was Lincoln truly being a shrewd chess player in all of this and made his moves when the time was right? And remember from childhood, in his famous Gettysburg Address, all those men had died there in Pennsylvania. And he says, however many years ago, our founding fathers brought forth a special republic that was predicated on the assumption that all men are created equal. So he's saying, hey, we're not just fighting to keep a country from splitting in two. We have a specially enlightened country that was given birth under the French Enlightenment and the notions of human equality. And we're making sure that that type of special republic can endure. And of course, to revisionists, that's just propaganda. But also in his defense is he worked tirelessly for the 13th Amendment. So as a man who during the war only declared free the slaves of rebels only, at the end of the war, by the end of the war, toward the end of the war, he brought forth a lot of effort to issue the definitive 13th Amendment that just ended slavery everywhere, under everyone. And then his final speech, Louisiana was creating a new state constitutional convention. They had elections, elected a convention, they met, they wrote a new constitution for the state of Louisiana that approved of the 13th Amendment to abolish the slaves. And they were going to send it to Congress to ask Louisiana to be readmitted into the Union, right? Because the South, each state had to start from scratch and do that to be re-annexed as states again. I can't remember which one was first because they both were pretty quickly defeated, Tennessee or or Louisiana. But at any rate, he gives a speech and he says, I hear what's going on in Louisiana. I'm very delighted by it. And he says, may I suggest that they, at the very least, give enfranchisement, citizenship rights to free and educated Negroes and to Negroes who had served in the Union Army. And 20 yards from him was his assassin, John Wilkes Booth. And he said, citizenship for inwards. That man just gave his last speech. And of course, within 24 hours, he killed him in Ford's Theater, where he shot him, and he lived a day or two and died. So at any rate, to some people, right, maybe I'm stretching it here, but after this dark revisionist take on all of this, including Lincoln, on number 3, I'm kind of going back to my childhood and I'm trying to help Lincoln out and suggest that he somewhat personally and intellectually and politically came around, that he was no abolitionist. The abolitionists never saw him as one of their own. They thought he was kind of a tease and a moderate. But he came around just enough for us to be perhaps a little bit proud of him. All right, so feel free to tear into that one if you're not buying it. Oh, and then of course, his second inaugural speech. In this inaugural speech, he's sounding like a religious abolitionist. He likens the Civil War to God's chastisement, that God is punishing the country, causing them to fight and kill one another and bleed in proportion to the injustice of slavery. And he says that perhaps God's going to allow it to last until every drop of blood that is dripped off of an oppressed slave who's been whipped to death has been kind of recompensed, if you will, like divine penance by the blood of a white soldier, northern or southern. And after he gave that speech, the guy he came to publicly and embraced and wanted to know what he thought of the speech and so forth, the moderates in DC were absolutely flabbergasted. It was a black man. It was Frederick Douglass. By the end of his life, Lincoln was unashamed of showing the utmost respect for Frederick Douglass and warmth for him, recognizing his humanity and almost treating him as an equal, to the degree that it disgusted some of the racist people in Lincoln's circle. They were shocked by it. But in fairness, I'll end with something a little bit more cynical. When he first met Frederick Douglass, he supposedly said, "My goodness, what an intelligent and articulate Negro." He was blown away that a black man could speak like that and could be so smart. So anyway, and then you have writings from Frederick Douglass. And to be honest, in his writings, this is just my subjective take, but I take it somewhere between court and revisionist. He says that Lincoln was a warm soul. He said that he had become an ally to the Negro, but he was never thought of himself as being one of us. So he always felt, Frederick Douglass, that this guy, he's not completely, freed from prejudice. He definitely is conscious of the fact that he is a white man and I'm a black man. And he's trying to overcome these prejudices. And we were not always his first priority, Douglass pretty much wrote. But in his own way and in his own time, he did help us. So does anybody have, kind of amalgamating all this together? Does anybody have a personal take on this that you'd like to share about these differing interpretations to the Civil War? I finally finished the first two. I'm going to try to do 1 to 2 a day on your assignments. I hope you notice that with the grading. Very, very well done. Very well done. You guys are getting these. You're smart. You're doing well. All right. So can I get a thumbs up at least from anybody? You guys feel pretty good about this one? Thank you, Sanjo. I appreciate that. All right. So I wish you guys well. I know you'll do well. Remember, for the sake of the test, even though you're evaluating and analyzing one, read all of it. All right. Read all of it in test preparation, and also just give you full context to what you think. But I tell you what, I count myself lucky being able to teach this stuff. This is great. This is fun stuff. All right. So you guys take care, okay? Have a great weekend. Be safe. Thank you.
Professor?
Yes.
I had a question. So I attended the Zoom meeting for the second assignment, but I only got 50 out of 50. I thought I should get 5 extra credit points, right?
Yes. And I crossed out, let me find that list, because I crossed out the names. Let's see here. Yeah, I have your name right here, and I have it crossed out. But you got 50?
Yeah, I got 50.
Okay, yeah. Somehow I crossed out your name, acknowledging you on that list, but did not give you your 5 points. So I apologize. I hope that was very anomalous and that didn't happen to anybody else. I circled your name. I'll go back to yours, okay? Correct that.
Thank you.
No problem.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes.
It happened to me too. For the second assignment, I was present and I didn't get the 5 points.
Aha. Yeah, and I have your name as well. My goodness. All right. Oh, okay, I circled your name as well, okay? Did that happen to anybody else? Because again, I have your names here and I have them crossed out. That's weird. But yeah, by all means, I appreciate your honesty with that because I certainly don't mean to jip anybody out of his points.
My the first two assignments, I also have 50 points instead of 55.
Okay, let's see here, hon. All right, shoot. You know what? With yours, I don't know how or why, but I don't have your name. But I will give you the benefit of the doubt. And yeah, so yours is different. I didn't cross it out, but failed to put the 5. I just literally don't have your name. But I'm writing your name down and I'm circling it. Because
That's because I use a different name. I use my nickname instead of my real one
Oh.
on these calls.
aha. Okay, no, absolutely. That makes sense. All right, so okay, so I have it now and I have it circled with the other 2 gentlemen. All right, so yeah, I will I'll rectify that, okay?
Mr. Cowell,
Yes.
I didn't get extra credit on the first 2 assignments as well.
Okay. Okay. All right, but I noticed 2 different voices, but the same name came up.
This is Jisha Benawadi speaking.
Okay, and I'm sorry, but who was speaking with me just prior to you? Was it the same first name with a different last name? Do I have 2 Jesus?
No, we're 2 different people.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to pronounce the previous person's name, but it's spelled Joie Valencia.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your help.
Mhm.
All right. Yeah. All right. Okay, are we good now?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Sorry about that.
No worries.
All right. Okay, guys. So I'm gonna go ahead and bid you adieu. And you guys have a good weekend and good luck with this. We're almost done. Hang in there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good one.